Good day, this is Shauna Casey, and welcome to this SOS educational webcast, Documenting the Process, Why You Shouldn't Rely on Memory Alone. Due to the large number of attendees, no conference call service is available for this webcast. The sound will broadcast through your computer speakers. However, if you wish to ask a question at any time during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the Questions and Answers panel of your GoToWebcast console, and we will do our best to answer them as they come in. Any questions that we don't get a chance to address during the webcast, we will follow up with afterwards in an email. This morning we sent an email with a link to the presentation materials to everyone that registered as of 10 a.m. Pacific this morning. You can also find the link to the materials under the Event Resources tab on your GoToWebcast console. This session will also be recorded, and we will send a link to the recording and materials in the next day or two. I hope that all of you are familiar with Stock and Option Solutions, or SOS as we are more commonly known. For those of you who are not, SOS is a leading stock administration, staffing, consulting, and outsourcing firm within the equity compensation marketplace. SOS provides interim and permanent placement, expert project resources, and total outsourcing solutions. To learn more, you can visit us online at www.sos-team.com or call us at 888-SOS-0199. Next, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers for today's session. We are pleased to have Julie Kenya and Sorrel Johnson on the panel today. Julie began working in equity compensation in 1993, managing the AT&T Long-Term Incentive Program. She led the stock administration team during AT&T's challenging years of corporate actions up through the final acquisition of AT&T Corp. By SBC Communications. Julie joined the team at SOS in 2006 and has been assisting clients with an extensive array of projects, including mergers, acquisitions, spin-offs, stock option exchanges and repricings, conversions, vendor searches, stock plan best practice reviews, training, day-to-day administration, and accounting-related reconciliations. Julie became a certified equity professional in 2008 and is a member of the professional services group at SOS. Sorrel began working in equity compensation in 1997 and has held equity management positions at NetApp, Redback Networks, and Ariba, an SAP company. She currently works for SOS as a senior equity compensation consultant. Sorrel speaks at various events, including industry webinars, the NASVP National Conference, GEO, and NASP University. Her areas of expertise include employee stock purchase plans, spin transactions, mergers and acquisitions, and she also has experience in global equity compliance in over 50 countries. Sorrel received her Certified Equity Professional designation in 2003, and she is a member of the Professional Services Group as well at SOS. Next is our standard disclaimer slide. We'd like to remind you to consult your own advisors before making any changes. As I mentioned, the materials are available on our website, and here again is the link. Thank you all for joining us today, and with that, I'll turn this presentation over to Sorrel, who will introduce the topic and cover the agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Shauna. I'd like to welcome everybody today to our webcast, Documenting the Process, Why You Shouldn't Rely on Memory Alone. And I'm going to quickly go through the agenda here and tell you what we're going to talk about during the webcast today. First, we'll cover why documentation is important, why you should do it. I know that lots of people hate documenting, and yes, it can be boring, but honestly, it really is a very important thing. And we'll talk about why as well. We'll talk about the processes that you should document and the level of detail that your documentation should include. We'll address who is the potential audience for your processes or documentation, where you should store it, and then just anything else that you could or should document. Now, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Julie to start us off with why documentation is important.
Thanks, Sorrel. Well, as you heard from our profiles when Shauna introduced us, between Sorrel and I, we're very old. We've been in this equity business a long, long time. And as part of being old and growing old, our minds are just not what they used to be. So not only is documentation important because of best practice or the ability to show consistency in performing equity procedures and processes, it's a good mind jogger for us. I can hardly remember sometimes what I had for breakfast yesterday, and having a document in front of me that helps me get through a daily process helps to jog the memory and helps me to remember. Additionally, having documentation, there is a very good audit trail of what you're supposed to be doing and a way to prove what you did. And that gets into the whole SOX requirements and compliance issues. Your auditors love to see that you actually followed a process and that it was documented. And then, of course, at this time of the year, you have those vacations, or maybe somebody's on a leave of absence due to an illness in the family or some other reason, and you just have no way to train that person in a very short period of time. But if you have all of your processes documented, there's a way for them to pick those up. And that's very critical when you have an unplanned absence due to a family emergency or some other issue. And not only that, I find that having a document in front of me or even a checklist, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is a good refresher to me for those infrequent processes, something that you don't do every single day, like an ESPP enrollment or a purchase. You may only do that quarterly or every 6 months. Proxy reporting, you're probably only doing that once a year, so now you have to remember what it is you did last year and figure out what you need to do this year. If you have your processes documented, then it becomes a whole lot easier to do that. It also shows to your management that you have a willingness to share and be a team player, and that, keep in mind that just because you know what you do every single day, if you don't share that with anybody, it doesn't help you in any way, and it certainly doesn't make it look like a job security for you. Some people feel, oh, if I don't tell anybody what I do, then I'm secure in my job. That's not true. So documentation is very, very important. What do you need to document? You can document anything you want, really, but the key things are that you want to document your everyday, daily, day-to-day tasks. This should be something that you would incorporate the things that you would do from the minute you walk into the office to the minute that you leave the office, so that in the event somebody has to fill in for you that day because you're out sick, it shouldn't be a surprise to them what they need to do to follow. It should be pretty easy for them to get through. And then, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's also a way for the auditors to say, oh, yes, you do, in fact, check off what you do, so we do know that you do, in fact, follow a process and have a guideline that you go through. So the day-to-day things that we typically see people document are your stock option exercises. What happens? What does your vendor require? What files go back and forth? Who needs to see what? Who gets what? RSU or RSA releases. Those are not only day-to-day, but may only occur once a week, once a month, once a year. So you want to be sure that you have everything laid out as to what you need to do, again, from morning till night. Demographic updates. Where does HR play a role? Where does payroll play a role? How do you get those updates? What do they entail? How often do they go back and forth to your administrator? And how often are they updated? New grants and, of course, your RSU, RSA, Performance Award updates. How do you do that? And again, even though we put them under day-to-day administration, they may only be something that you do once in a while. And so it's important to know and remember what it was you were supposed to do. Section 16 processes. These can be a little bit more cumbersome because you may have to involve your legal team. You want to make sure that you know who has to get what form at what time, what are your potential passwords. If you have to get into a filing system, what's the process for that? Monthly, quarterly processes. This is where we typically see SOX documentation actually have a checklist for the stock administrator that says, I validated my exercises this month or this quarter. I validated the grants into the system and out of the system. I validated that the shares match in total to all of the transactions. I validated terminations and I validated cancellations. So sometimes they like to see that, particularly when there's been a deficiency that's been identified where processes weren't followed in the past, and they want to see exactly what you did and the day you did it, and sometimes they want sign-off. So having a way to do that and to show them that you stepped through each individual step of the way for your monthly and quarterly close is always a valued asset for the SOX compliance. Year-end processes, these are where you've already reached the end of your rope. It's usually the end of the calendar year, sometimes fiscal year for some companies. You've got 100 things on your plate. You've got not only your year-end reporting, but you may have your payroll reporting for your W-2 income. So you've got payroll after you for that information. You may have 6039 happening for your ISOs and your ESPT. So having all of these things laid out exactly what has to be done and when is critical. Additionally, there's those unusual processes, the manual workarounds, processes that involve other departments where something that comes to mind is your DWAC or your share reconciliation and cash reconciliation. Do you know how that happens? Do you know who does that? Is there any involvement from your perspective? These things should be written down. They should be noted. Anything that's out of the ordinary that's particular to your position. And again, I mentioned earlier the infrequent processes, the ESPP that happens once in a while, proxy reporting. And two of the ones that always are kind of problematic are death and divorce. I can't tell you how many times that we get questions about what to do in those situations because it has not been identified or written down for the stock administrator, and they can't figure out what to do. So rather than waiting for the event to happen, it's good to have that laid out ahead of time. Another thing is the team members, who is involved and what are their titles and emails and phone numbers. And that gets back to the infrequent processes more than anything else. The last thing that you want to do is at the end of the year, as you're stumbling through your year end and you're realizing that you don't remember how your ESPP is supposed to happen, somebody's pounding you for your proxy report charts or data, and then all of a sudden you remember that you needed to contact Treasury, but you can't remember who and you can't remember what, and that person's no longer there. Don't add that extra burden to yourself if you can have this all laid out ahead of time and circle back at certain periods of time, make it part of your process to circle back and to say, in October I need to go back to this team member and make sure I have all of my I's dotted and T's crossed for year end. So make it part of your day-to-day, monthly, quarterly processing. And I think, Sorrel, you wanted to share something about a problem that you saw in the past that had to do with transfer agents, dual transfer agents, and how that was an unusual process, but it became a problem for a company.
It did, and I do. We talk about processes that are out of the ordinary, and little known fact, if you are incorporated in Singapore, which there are some companies that are out there that are incorporated in Singapore but do trade on a U.S. exchange, you have to have a transfer agent based in Singapore, and then you're allowed to have one in the U.S. Well, I can tell you that most of the transfer agents that we're all familiar with and we use every day are not based in Singapore. And, come end of the quarter, end of the year, you have to make sure both of them are in balance. And you have to notify them, the Singapore transfer agent, about all of your activity so that, of course, they can be in balance with your U.S. transfer agent. And that adds an added layer of complexity. And somebody might not think about, somebody in finance who might be your backup, if you're at a Singapore company, they may not think, oh, hey, I have to notify this second transfer agent. And kind of along those lines as well, when we talk about team members, yes, we're definitely talking about our internal within the company team members, but team members can be outside of the company as well. Going back to the transfer agents, if you have a DWAC that hasn't cleared and maybe you got online and you can't figure out why it hasn't cleared, you pick up the phone and you call your rep or you call your account manager. Well, if you're not there, somebody else may not know who to call. They may not know who to call at your broker because an employee has a question about a trade and why it hasn't settled or the breakdown of the trade. So make sure on your team member list that you do include the folks that you work with outside of the company at your vendors because they're an important part of your team as well.
Yep, that's very, very true. And to add on to that, I fell into a situation many years ago with a client we were working with that had a UK plan. And, of course, this week is a very critical week, next 2 weeks actually, for those people with UK plans. And I came on board just about the time that I know that April had hit and probably should have been pulling down information relative to the equity plan for the UK filing. And I asked the management at the client I was at, and they had no idea what I was talking about. And there were no process documents in place, and there was no prior filing folder anywhere that had any information in it. So tracking down the right people in the UK that I had to deal with for that particular client took me almost 2 weeks just to identify who it was that I should have been contacting to get the information to. And then it took that person another 2 weeks to actually figure out what to do with it because they didn't have any process documents in place. And then it took another week to get it back to the U.S. to get it signed off by the corporate secretary. Well, they actually filed, and this was in the old paper world, they actually filed on the hour before the deadline. And had they had everything in place ahead of time, we wouldn't have had that aggravation or that pain. So just a couple stories there to hopefully scare you a little bit. All right, so next, level of detail. So you say, okay, all right, I get it. I have to have procedures. I hear you. Who has time to do this? So what are you talking about? What's the level of detail that I should have? Who's really going to look at it? What do they care? Well, one of the first things that I always try to start off with is a checklist. That's checklist, not checklist. We'll correct that, get that on the new slide. That checklist is really a step-by-step for me that says, here's the basics and the timeline in which I have to do it. And it can be, I'll show you some samples in a little while, but it can be very, very simple or it can be very, very detailed. But that gets me through the day. It gets me to realize, okay, did I pull down my exercises today? Yes. Did I send them off to payroll for any verification? Yes. Did I get them back over to my vendor in time? Yes. Did I send my DWAC? Yes. And why do I need that? You think it's kind of, too much detail, but how many times do you get interrupted during the course of the day when you're in the middle of doing these very intricate processes and somebody comes and knocks on your door or is bugging you because they have an urgent need, and you get interrupted, and then you have to sit down and say, oh my gosh, did I do that? Did I remember? So having a checklist reminds me and keeps me sane. And then what I try to do is, after I have my checklist in place, I'll try to expand on that as time allows. And it's funny that we're doing this presentation right now because vacation period is happening, It's sort of an off-peak period for some clients. There's time to catch up. It's time to clean up. This might be a good time to say, all right, I have some processes. I have them on some paper. Let me figure out how to put them in a format that would work for me and work for somebody stepping into my role or having to fill in when I'm out sick. So I expand on my checklist as time permits, and I expand on it using things like the narratives that I call them. And that's really details about my company, details about my company plans. Why do I do this? How do I do this? Who's involved? And that's a good way to get into some specifics about you as a company and your role so that anybody who even didn't have the slightest indication of having any stock knowledge would understand what a stock option was, what a restricted stock unit was, what do you mean by a DWAC, those kinds of details. And then I'll take it another level and say, okay, now, so how does that relate to the particular equity platform that I'm on? If I'm on platform XYZ, what do I have to do in that platform to make these things happen? And I'll try to include screenshots if I can. And of course, we'll get into a little bit about that with security, but having a screenshot in my process document, not only, I'm a very visual person, so it helps me to see what I have to do, but it also helps me to expand on that a little bit further and show someone else how they have to do it. And then you can also get into process flows. Process flows, they can be really complex, or they can be just a simple process flow that you write down on a piece of paper, scan it in, and put it into your document. And it can, of course, be a combination of all of these things. You just eventually, over time, you start to accumulate all of this, and you can pull it together into something that's very, very cohesive. And it could be passed off to anyone who steps into your position at any point in time. And run with your job so you don't have to be there looking over their shoulder. And I've got a couple of samples here, and I know it's really hard to see on the screen, but when you're able to, if you have the PDF on your file, it's easy to see the snippets of the samples that I provided. So in the checklist, which is off to the left, it's just a snippet of the Excel file that I talked about. So it gives you a task. I'd say what it is, when during the day I have to do it, what it is I have to do, and any special comments. And then sometimes off to the side, I'll have a spot for my initials. And then I can just go through and initial as I go through that procedure. And at the end of the day, let's say this relates to my daily tasks. At the end of the day, I've got it complete. I can simply just file it into my daily folder on my company drive. And the good news is we all use the cloud these days that, you can save this off to your company folder somewhere so you have your daily activities in that company folder that you can say, yep, this is what I did today. And then I talked a little bit about the details and getting into more and more gory details, and that's the snippet in the middle, if you will. And that's just a look at a table of contents, and you can see it's pretty long. It doesn't include everything, but what you can get there is a sense of how detailed the processes were that, in this particular case, I took them to a very detailed level. And I took them out to not only what's the general equity administration knowledge that I would need to know. So, what is an option? What is an RSU? What is a plan document? What is a grant? What is a participant? But then I took it down to another level and said, okay, so how does that relate to me as my company? How does my company role play into this? You could be in a position where your company does not issue incentive stock options or ISOs. But all of a sudden, one day they do, and you have no idea what it means. But if you have some snippets about that in your overall equity administration binder, it's a quick reference. So you can say, oh, yeah, that's right. That's what that means. I need to know about that. And then the final one off to the right there is another table of contents, which are actually some document, a snippet of inside of a document that actually shows you how I set up a procedure for an individual plan, if you will. So, you know, you can go from, like I said, the checklist into the real details, the gory details. Just depends on how far you want to go. And then I have a sample here of a process flow, and this is just a quick high-level ESP process flow that I have in an Excel format. It's fun to play with this. Sometimes it keeps you sane because you're not in, doing things that are so mundane. But it also reminds you and helps you to figure out, oh, geez, how do I do that? Oh, how did I get that over there? How do I send that file over to the vendor? Good question. So these not only jog your memory, but it also puts it down on a piece of paper, and you can just, like I said, simply draw these out, scan them in, and put them into your document. And I like to have different tabs in my Excel file with each one of these processes and make them pretty expanded. And some people like to do swim lanes and all of that fun stuff as it relates to process flows. I'm not a process flow guru, but it's fun to play with these. So don't be afraid. Just get down and start playing. Document, document, document. So Sorrell's going to take us into some of the audience.
Thank you. So who is going to be the audience for the processes and the procedures that you're documenting? Well, it may be someone with absolutely no stock admin experience, and I have a monkey there. And the reason that I do is I walked into a company, and the guy who brought me in said, I want you to document everything this department does. And the company was about 20 years old, and it had about 14,000 employees worldwide. And he said, when you're done with this documentation, I want a monkey to be able to sit down and go through it and know what they're doing. Now, I don't think that he ever really contemplated bringing a chimpanzee in to, interview for a job or anything like that. But his point was well taken. He was worried that, first of all, there were things in the company that maybe only, an outgoing stock administrator who had been there for a long time knew, or that there were really complicated processes that needed to be explained and documented in detail. Now, as a side note, the process document that I ended up drafting for this company wound up being 270 pages. Now, it seems scary, but it evolved over time, and it did include everything from what Julie talked about with the most basic checklist through a narrative about processes and how they had changed, which we'll talk about in a minute here. And it even spelled out at quarter end what reports are run, who are they sent to. And there were 2 pages in there of contacts, HR, payroll, outside vendors, Section 16 brokers. So, it was a very thorough document, and it was great when it was done. And I know that when I say 270 pages, there are probably about half the people have now dropped off the webinar like, no way can I do this. But, again, it evolved from probably 15 to 20 pages of checklists that got dropped in, and then somebody said, oh, but we should talk about this. So keep in mind that the audience may be somebody who doesn't know anything about stock admin. If you are lucky enough to actually have a backup within your company, they may use this. Most likely when you're gone, they will be tearing their hair out, and they will be so thankful that you left them this. Because, again, they may have no stock admin experience, or you may be lucky and you may be in a department of more than one person and you have somebody who is familiar. But chances are, back up within your company, they'll use this as well. Now, if you don't have a backup within your company, you may have to bring in somebody from the outside. And again, they will be very happy and very thankful that you've documented all of this so that they can pull it out, look at it, and really not miss a step, make sure that everything is covered. Your boss?
And I would also say to that, Sorrel, having been in that position and come in and looked at a document that was 270 pages, from the outside looking in, I found a lot of things that I was able to add benefit to and provide to that stock administrator so that they were able to enhance that 270 pages with more critical information.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about especially complicated equity programs, you know, really it can easily run to 300 before you've totally explained it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially if you're going to add screenshots, which are real helpful, but they can add to the size, but it's worth putting them in.
Exactly. Now, most likely your boss may use this. Your boss may fall into your backup within the company category. You may give this to your boss if you really want your boss to know how invaluable you are. Give them the 270-page document you end up with and say, this is what I do. Because really it talks about, as Julie mentioned before, it talks about everything you do. And it, you know, can show your boss, hey, I just don't process grants and exercises. This is the full range and scope of my responsibilities. Now, the other thing is the auditors may ask to see it. Now, the reason that they may ask to see it is they may want to know if your processes fall in line with the SOX controls. Now, conversely, you may want to add your SOX controls and point out in your documentation, this is considered to be a control. This is why we send this report to the boss to be cross-checked. And lastly, as we've discussed, for those old people amongst us with memory issues, we will be using our procedures and will be part of the potential audience for this document.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So now storing your documentation. This is a delicate balancing act between accessibility and data privacy. Way back in the early days of Sarbanes-Oxley, everybody had a binder. I mean, do we all remember when the auditors were like, well, where's the binder? Where's the binder? We all had a binder, and we all had either very primitive processes. This was far before, controls and material deficiencies and the flow charts that auditors bring in now. And we all had a binder on our desk, and it had a variety of things in it. It might have our plan, it might have notes, it might have a checklist or two. But now it's way more sophisticated. And so we need to keep, checklists. If you want to keep checklists on your physical desk itself in a binder, as long as it doesn't contain employee information, more power to you. But when
I think you also, Sorrel, I'm sorry, you also want to make sure it doesn't contain any of your system passwords in that.
I was just about to say.
Sorry.
You don't want to save system logins, passwords out in the open like that. That's something that would need to go on an internal network or, as Julie said, in the cloud. Now, I know you're probably all thinking, oh, but everybody says don't ever write your password down. Well, I agree you should never write your password down, but in this day and age when we have a password for every single function in our lives, I don't know how people remember them without keeping a repository of them somewhere. Now, saving them on your internal network, make sure that not everybody has access to this folder that you're saving it to. It kind of defeats the purpose if everybody can get in it and use it. And when you are looking at confidential information in your documentation. Make sure that, again, password usernames are not out in the open where people can get to them. You don't want to have employee-specific data or, say, personal phone numbers out where just anybody can access them. And the screenshots that Julie and I have mentioned, screenshots are great, but most likely you're taking a screenshot of somebody's grant, somebody's release, somebody's account. That's going to have account numbers. It's going to show how many shares they were granted. That's all confidential, and you don't want everybody in the world to have access to that. And as it's mentioned, your storage mechanism itself may be subject to audit and compliance reviews. I have been at several companies where they audited frequently who had access to what was called the stock drive. We all have one. It's that internal folder where you basically keep everything and you save all that stuff that you have to for your backup. And we had to every quarter look at, IT provided us with a list of people who had authorization to view and or save things to those folders. And we had to make sure that it was still appropriate that they had access to said folders.
Yeah, and one of the, I just want to point out a couple of things. One time, and this was it probably still happens, this was very prominent, and I'm sure it still goes on, storing of the documentation. I was at a client where the documents were actually printed out every single day, so all your transactions printed on paper. Someone reviewed them, somebody signed them, somebody initialed them, and those papers were put back into a folder for manila folder, and put into the file cabinet. And the file cabinet was locked every night. And the key, everybody knew where the key was. And it was easily accessible because it was just sitting underneath of the person's calendar on their desk. And so if the cleaning person came in and moved things around, the key was right there and exposed. And in that file cabinet and those transactions were Social Security numbers. So it was, old school, that was normal. But in the new environment, in the new world that we're facing, I think those types of procedures have to be revisited and maybe handled a little bit differently these days. Likewise, one other way to get around password and username issues is technically your stock administrator should have a password and access into a particular system, but their assigned backup or boss should have their own password or username into a particular system so that there's never sort of a cross-contamination of that, if you will. A lot of systems actually track who the user was that was in the system to make that particular transaction or make that change. And if you are contaminating by passing your passwords back and forth and sharing them, that can be a problem if you have some deficiencies in your SOX compliance, and they have found that to be one of them. So if it comes to passwords and usernames, rather than sharing them, sometimes it's better to make sure that all of the key individuals have their own and have the ability to get into them and actually test them on a regular basis so they make sure they're not expired in the event that they need to use them.
So, Julie, I always heard that it was underneath the plant, not the calendar.
Oh, no, calendar.
Okay. It was always under the plant where I worked. Okay, so we've talked about what we document on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly basis. So then that brings up, what else could I or should I document? Well, again, one-time events are always something that you should document, namely historical stock split, forward and reverse. Make sure that you keep all of the backups that you can. board minutes, SEC filings, any employee communications that went out regarding the stock split. Vitally important, the equity adjustment process. You know, when was it done? How was it done? Were shares rounded up or down? What was cashed out? Because inevitably, you are going to need to know it because there's going to be that employee, and we all have had one of these, who 2 years later comes back and says, when we had that reverse stock split, I had a fractional share and I don't know that it got paid out, or I don't know that it was rounded properly. Again, it's one of the nightmares that we all fear and dread, but employees always come back. They always come back with questions. And, I mean, I've had employees come back 5 and 6 years later saying, oh, by the way, I need this information not necessarily for myself, but the IRS is asking for it. There was a lot of that went around in 2010, 2011 when the economy wasn't at its most robust, and the IRS, quite frankly, was looking for tax money. And a lot of people got audited, and a lot of questions came in about amounts and cost basis and how things were treated. So it's always good to have that at your fingertips. Also, merger and acquisition activity and any special treatment. Now, as Julie can attest, every merger and acquisition is different. There is no standard template, and there will be different quirks with each deal. And sometimes you will run into things where employees may get 6 months or 12 months post-termination to exercise their options, or they may continue to vest after termination. It is a good thing to document that, not only for yourself, but again for anybody else. You have it down in writing. You have possibly some backup from the lawyers or an HR department that you can include. Now, along with this, it's good to keep in your documentation the acquired company equity plan. And I actually had this happen to me. I was working at a company where employees were given 3 months post-termination to exercise their stock options. We acquired our biggest competitor, and their plan stipulated that you had 90 days post-termination. Now, we all know that 3 months and 90 days are not always the same thing. And we had someone who said, oh, they came back to us, they had terminated, they were an acquired employee holding acquired options, but still under their plan, and they came back because they waited until the last day of the 3-month period and said, hey, my options are canceled. I should have gotten 3 months. And the response was, no, you had 90 days under your plan. Now, I will admit, when the employee first came back and, they yelled at the broker and then they yelled at me, I panicked a little bit because I thought, oh my gosh, something didn't work here. What's going on? Why is this person's option canceled? And then when I started looking at it, I pulled their plan out and saw that they had 90 days, not 3 months. Now, the employee sued the company, and they lost. But we had that documentation, and it was important. It was a comfort for me, I have to say, that day when I was trying to deal with the employee. So, always important.
Yeah, I did that a number of times myself. Having worked at AT&T, we had a few acquisitions, and we had plans from all over the place that had equity in all different forms and all different termination provisions. And if we didn't have that chart, and the chart was huge, it could have taken up a full whiteboard, it would have been impossible to manage because there was no way for us to remember who had what had, you know, at that time some of the systems were pretty primitive too, so it was really even more difficult, and it became very important to have that documentation. But it also, again, proved my worth to my then boss that I was probably the only one in the company that knew all this and had it on paper so that in the event I wasn't there, that someone else could take over and could, you know, understand the situations. But to him, he didn't understand why it took me so long to do certain things, and this was a way to prove this is why. We have all of this stuff.
Right. Now, another thing you should definitely document is your fiscal year end. Now, all of you semiconductor companies, hardware companies who run on 52, 53-week years or run 4-4-5 quarters, I'm talking to you. Because let's face it, most of us don't work for just one company during our lives. So you're going to move on, and maybe you're going to move into a position where you have a fiscal year that does not align with a calendar year. And somebody comes to you and says, oh, can you run this for me for fiscal 13? And you think, okay, when is fiscal 13? The company I referenced before that had been around for 20 years, they were on a 52, 53-week year, and their year ended on the last Saturday in April. And they ran 4-4-5 quarters. So for those of you that think I'm speaking in a different language, a 4-4-5 quarter is where your first month is 4 weeks, your second month of the quarter is 4 weeks, and then your fifth month of the quarter is 5 weeks. It's kind of an old school, and again, it's a lot of hardware and semiconductor companies that set their quarters and fiscal year ends up like that. So it's always helpful to have the fiscal year-end dates at a glance so that anybody can see them and run anything that they need to. Always keep a full list of your current Section 16 reporters and previous reporters. You know, if somebody walks in to back you up and maybe your system doesn't allow them to see that somebody is an insider or a Section 16 reporter, they may process the releases that day and not know that they need to file a Form 4. Or there may be an option exercise and they don't know that they need to let the legal department who files the Form 4s know. So make sure that you've always got that. With the previous reporters, you are going to need to survey them at proxy time and send them a proxy questionnaire if they were a reporter at any point during the last fiscal year. So it's good to have their names up front and center, especially if you're responsible for pulling together information that goes in those D&O questionnaires. Another item to document divorced employees and their non-employee former spouses. If you have had to divide up equity due to a divorce, that is one of the hardest things to do in the systems. You get it done, but the employee terminates, and you forget to terminate the non-employee former spouse. It's a heartbreaker because that's the easiest part of divorce that you'll have to deal with is simply terminating the person when their divorced employee spouse leaves the company. So make sure you've got that documented as well. And last, company policies, or lack thereof. Some companies don't have policies. For example, if you don't do anything and you don't apportion taxes for mobile employees, document it. That way there's no question. Grant guidelines are always a good thing to have documented. Chargeback agreements, if you have them in place, and what jurisdiction, who your transfer agent is, if you're a Singapore company, who both of them are, and tolling vesting for LOAs. Now, this is one, again, I used to work with a company that they did toll vesting if you went on a leave of absence, so vesting stopped. And it became problematic for them. They had one vesting a month. And with these people who would go on and have their vesting told, then there were all these releases randomly. They didn't like that. And it was hard with the expense to get everything right, and there were always late notifications from HR when somebody came back. So they decided at one point that they weren't going to toll vesting. They picked a date on the calendar, drew a line in the sand, and said, we're not going to do this anymore. Now, it's good to have that documented because maybe you're not there when somebody goes on a leave of absence and HR says, oh, yeah, here's your LOA report, and the person looks in the system, well, I see that some people have been told. I guess I'll go ahead and put this person on hold as well. So any changes in company policy are always something that's great to document as well.
Yeah, and I've actually seen where, like you said, the lack thereof. What I found recently, Sorrel, is a lot of companies that have started granting performance awards in particular, because, that's real popular. They don't find, or we can't find in the plan document or in the award agreement, it doesn't specify things like rounding when the performance ratio is applied. So, we bring that to their attention, but if you are at the point of vesting and the performance criteria has been met and you have to apply, 75% of the performance goal to the shares, and you do that application and you discover that it's giving you a fraction of 0.256 shares, what do you do with that fraction? And if it's in your company policies, you can sort of put that in your documentation as well as to what should happen. And if it's not in the company policies, if you're ahead of the curve on this, you can go back to legal and say, what do we do? What do we do? We need a policy. So it's good to have those types of policies included in some of your documentation as well.
Agreed. And in your position or in your situation that you described, it's good to know maybe we don't have a policy on rounding, but last time this happened, I rounded up or I rounded down.
Right. What was the precedent of that activity? Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Right. Good.
So what's next? Well, once you've taken steps and started documenting everything, you can go take that long-needed vacation and enjoy yourself, knowing that somebody will be able to follow your written instructions and your procedures. Now, a lot of people don't, as Julie talked about earlier, they talk about job security. Well, if I'm the only one who knows it, they won't fire me. But in reality, this proves your worth and what you do and the value you provide. The other thing that always made me crazy is when people say, oh, well, the stock is down. How much can you really have to do? Somebody says that you drop a 270-page procedure manual on their desk and you go, that's what I have to do. So I know that this all seems like a really daunting task, but what we talked about before, start with your checklist. Take your checklist, dump them into a document. Maybe you add some narrative. Talk about a little bit of history. You take your grant checklist, drop it in, and you say, we grant RSUs. We no longer grant stock options. We stopped granting stock options in 2013. Right there, you've already got a page. The other thing that I like to do is I like to put a header in my document that says basically what this is, i.e. grant process, and then the last time it was updated. It was edited on April 16th, 2016. That way somebody can look at that and say, oh, okay, well, this is fairly fresh. This is like within the past quarter, as opposed to you pull it out and you see, oh, this was last updated in 2010. I wonder if they do things the same way. start small. Start small and grow. Every time that you do something or you process something, add a little bit to the document. And again, if you're struggling on where to start, ask for help or talk to the people who back you up. Say, what do you need help on when I'm gone? What would be of value to you?
Right, and we did get a question that came in on that, Sorrel, about is there a boiler template that you can follow for your process document? I've not seen one, but a good place to start is sometimes in your equity platform. Sometimes the equity vendor will have some checklists for you for daily activity, or things like adding a grant to the system, deleting a grant from the system, processing a release. I like to tell folks, start with those checklists and then expand those into your own. Because it's not like, there's really nothing out there to just pick up and go with, and so much of it can be very sensitive, data sensitive to different clients, so it's really hard to just say, okay, here's a boilerplate and run with it. But I would suggest starting with the equity vendor that you utilize and trying to look at their checklist first.
I agree. And, you know, another good place to start is the chart of who do you talk with on a daily basis? Who is instrumental in how you do your job? Okay, who's your HR contact? Who's your payroll contact? Who's your account rep at your transfer agent? Who's the account rep at your equity vendor? I mean, all of that can be pulled into a chart that can also be put in the front of the document and to really help get you focused. And you say, oh, I use this person, I talk with this person in payroll about disqualifying dispositions. That's who I send this to, or RSU releases and the taxability. That will spur your mind as to other things to put in the document.
Right, and then there's a couple of other sites, too, that you can kind of go to. I think the NASPP probably has some things to start you on if you wanted to take a look at what they have available. The other place might be the NCEO. In fact, we did just get a notice about that, the National Center of Employee Ownership. They do have some templates out there for private companies. So depending upon what your need is and what your company role is, you can start at a couple of those places. But, you know, the checklist, just going through one by one is your basis. Great. Any questions other than those? All right. So I think we have reached the end. Shauna, do you want to take it from here?
Great. Thank you. Yes, I'd like to thank you, Julie and Sorrel, for joining us today, and thank all of you for attending today's educational webcast. Please go ahead and look for an email in the next couple of days with links to the recording and materials. Thanks so much and have a great day. Bye-bye.